The morning smelled of dust and cooling metal from the old Land Cruiser. Heat already shimmered over the grass, turning the horizon into a wavering ribbon. Ray Nolan let the truck idle and listened. Coffee gone bitter in the chipped mug. Birds stitched through the quiet, and somewhere a jackal barked and fell silent. 2 days of no sign in this quadrant gnawed at him like a loose tooth. He checked the map, the pencil marks he'd made when he'd last patrolled here. The radio hissed with nothing but his own breath, steady, tired, human. Then came a sound so small it could have been wind slipping through stone. Not a roar, not even a growl, just a rasping scrape that made his skin tighten. He switched off the engine, and the silence settled, full of something waiting. He stepped out, solace crunching through brittle seed pods and dry dung. The sun hit the back of his neck like a hand that didn't lift. Vultures rode a lazy circle above a thicket and drifted on again. Ray moved toward the acacia stand, counting paces, measuring the distance by habit. The smell-changed earth opened up, a wet, mineral breath from underground. Grass hit a depression until his boot tipped the edge and slid. He dropped to his knees, grabbing roots, peering into a shadow deeper than noon. A flicker of tawny fur caught light and vanished like a struck match. The scrape came again, followed by a slow exhale that trembled at the end. "Easy," he said to the dark, voice hoarse from days of not talking. His eyes adjusted, and the pit shaped itself sides sheer, walls packed clay. 10, maybe 12 feet down, a lioness lay coiled like a broken spring. Her ribs rose and fell in uneven beats, each breath a negotiation. Dust clung to her whiskers, and burrs knotted the pale fur of her belly. One paw reached for the wall, claws worn dull by hours of trying. The pads were cracked, pressed flat against stone that gave nothing back. She lifted her head at his scent, ears tipping, eyes the color of tea. In them he recognized the kind of exhausted ferocity he'd seen before. Not at him, at the world that had narrowed to 4 cold walls. "I see you, girl," Ray murmured, and the words steadied his hands. He had missed this quadrant when the storm stripped the road 2 mornings ago. He doubled back, found a flooded culvert, and told himself home could wait. A picture frame on his kitchen table had watched him eat in the quiet. He'd carried that quiet back with him like a second canteen, heavy and full. Years ago, a snare had taken a young male, and the memory still bit. He remembered the weight of helplessness, the way it sits behind the heart. Not this time, he told the hole, the grass, the wide listening day. The lioness blinked slowly, as if weighing his promise in the heat. Flies found the corners of her eyes. She did not bother to lift a paw. He opened the truck bed, inventorying rope, canvas, an old ladder that creaked. The radio gave him static and his own name, as if repeating it might help. Service dead out here, towers hiding behind hills that looked closer than they were. He set the handset down and tested the rope with both hands, twice. The fibers bit his palms where calluses had softened since the rains began. Age announced itself in small aches he pretended not to hear. He shook out the canvas tarp, dust ghosts rising and dissolving in sunlight. A plan came together in pieces, as they always did in the field. Anchor the rope to the hitch, pad the wall, make the descent a suggestion. The risk was not the drop. It was trust, thin as a hair in the air. "Stay with me," he said, not sure who he meant. He moved slow, boots careful, talking in the steady rhythm animals recognize. The lioness watched him with that ancient, unblinking attention that feels like a mirror. He slid the tarp over the lip so it draped like shade against the wall. The pit accepted it with a soft hiss of cloth on clay. He tied the rope in a bowline and fed it down hand over hand. Heat radiated from the exposed ground, lifting the smell of iron and sun. A beetle ticked past his knuckle, stubborn, shining like a tiny helmet. "Good girl," he said when she didn't lunge. Didn't waste energy on fear. She lowered her head, not submission, just surrender to the gravity of exhaustion. He leaned in farther to judge the distance and felt the world tilt. There a thread of sound under her breath, thinner than a reed in wind. He froze, letting silence expand until it pressed against his eardrums. The lioness's ear twitched, the smallest movement, like a needle finding a groove. Ray held his own breath and counted 1, 2, 3 to keep from guessing. The sound came again, staccato, a soft gasp that didn't belong to her. Not wind, not insect, not the ground sighing as heat shifted its weight. He edged the tarp wider, coaxing more light to fall into the blue dark. Dust motes flowed like minnows, catching sun then vanishing in the shade. The lioness turned slightly, as if to shelter something tucked against her. The rope burned his palm as he gripped it, every nerve listening. He saw then a flicker of movement along the cradle of her ribcage. Just a tremor at first, a whisper of fur where there should be only dust. His eyes watered from the angle, or from relief he was afraid to name. She lifted her chin an inch, the way a mother makes space without moving away. Ray shifted again, hunting the line between courage and folly on the rim. Somewhere above them, a vulture croaked, and the sound fell like a stone. In the hush that followed, the tiny breath answered once more, unmistakable. He leaned farther than was wise, and the tarp sighed under his boot. The pit held its own breath with him, everything balanced on the edge. Because down there with her, something small had just opened its eyes. Light pooled in the pit like cooled bronze, and the shape beneath it shifted. What he'd read as a glimmer of eyes was only sun catching dust in a slow swirl. The truth was smaller, softer, a muzzle nosing for warmth along her belly. Skin like wet velvet, fur still clumped, a heartbeat you had to imagine to hear. Ray pressed his wrist to the rim and felt his own pulse answer in the heat. "All right," he breathed, as if the word could become shade or water. The lioness's ear tilted toward him, then back to the bundle tucked tight. Her breath hitched, then steadied into a low, stubborn rhythm. He knew the edge between fierce and spent. She was walking it blindfolded. He slid backward on his knees and reached for the canteen. He tied the canteen to the rope with a knot his father taught him by lamplight. Metal clicked against metal, a small, honest sound that calmed his hands. He stripped off his bandana, folded it under the canteen to quiet the swing. "Coming down," he said, as if announcing himself to a neighbor's porch. The rope whispered as it fed through his palms, grit catching in the lines. He paused a foot above her reach and tipped, letting water tongue the air. The lioness lifted, lapped, paused, lapped again, the sound raw as paper tearing. Drops flashed off her whiskers and darkened the clay where they fell. She drank like every swallow counted, which it did for both of them. The cub nuzzled into the motion and made a sound too small for names. Jerky from his breast pocket tasted of salt and road miles when he bit it. He chewed for something to do and then laughed once at himself, no sound. She wasn't interested in his food. The work she did was older than hunger. He cut the strip anyway, lowered it. She sniffed and turned back to the cub. "Right," he said softly, and the word carried his history back to him. A table set for two for years after there was only one. A woman's hand folded around a coffee mug, steam painting the morning thin. He blinked until the pit's edges sharpened again, until he was only here. The radio thunked against the truck door with a wind nudge. Useless. He set it high on the fender, as if height could coax a signal from sky. The ladder rattled like old bones as he slid it from the bed. Aluminum hot enough to brand, wrung space for feet heavier than her paws. He tested each rivet with a thumb and a memory of accidents in other seasons. The tarp went over first, pegged with stones along the rim for friction. He laid the ladder on that skin of canvas, made a shallow angle against clay. It wasn't perfect. Nothing out here ever was when you needed it fast. "Look, girl," he called, pointing like a fool, but it made him feel useful. She watched without moving, reading him like weather, choosing not to spend. He shoved a branch under the base to keep it from skidding. The cub squeaked once, and the sound lit every nerve in his back. He measured the drop with his eyes, and then with the rope twice. His body answered with a chorus of objections he filed under later. He looped the rope around his waist, a belt over a belt, snugged tight. Boots off? No, he'd need their edges. He laced them hard and double-knotted. "Don't be stupid," he told himself, and heard her breathe as if agreeing. A moth staggered in the heat between them, wings ragged as old paper. He pictured his hands on a cub's damp fur and stopped the picture there. Touch was a promise you couldn't unmake with an animal like this. He pulled the rope up again and settled for staying on his side of the line. There were other ways to ask for cooperation besides stepping into her night. He lowered the ladder inch by inch until it kissed the floor of the pit. It shifted, groaned, and his heart tried to leave by his throat. The lioness flinched, then stilled, eyes narrow, breath thin and countable. Ray waited, hand on rope, counting with her so he wouldn't rush. A cloud stretched across the sun and the heat softened by a fraction. "Easy," he said, and the latter answered with its own long sigh. He edged it nearer to her forepaws, letting it be a suggestion, not a demand. The tarp cushioned the side, making a rough ribbon out of a wall. She placed one paw on the lowest rung, tested, took it back. Even that was a kind of yes he didn't dare celebrate aloud. Shadows lengthened into the pit like cooling oil spilled carefully. A hoopoe traded places with a starling on the acacia, chatter fading to hush. Far off, hyenas yipped, thin at first, and then thicker as the air cooled. The sound brushed his skin the way cold water does when you don't expect it. He gathered dead thorn and set it in a loose ring around the rim. Not a fence, just an idea, something for movement to tangle on. He found a scrap of burlap in the truck and made a silly little flag of warning. The radio gave him one breath of someone else's voice, then swallowed it. He thought of driving for help and pictured the pit alone in the blue dark. "I'm here," he told the lions in the light and whatever listens. He settled on his heels, legs prickling, and listened to the land change gears. The cub made that small hiccup sound again, then again, a rhythm like rain. He tracked it with his eyes, useless, because it came from under her chest. "Strong one," he whispered, and the word had warmth he hadn't expected. The lioness's whiskers twitched, she shifted, and clay crackled under her shoulder. Ray leaned a little to steady the ladder, though it didn't need him at all. The pit held their breathing the way a shell holds the sea. Then the air stitched itself with a second thinner thread of sound. A new cry rose beside the first, sticky with beginning, fragile and clear. He turned to the dark and counted 2 little heartbeats where he'd feared one. Night poured into the pit in slow blue layers until edges blurred. Wind combed the grass and left it laying one way, then another. Ray's breath ghosted in the cooler air, a welcome change and a warning. Hyenas giggled far off, the kind of sound that lifts the hairs on calves. He fed a small, smokeless fire with dung and dry twigs, more ember than flame. Its scent drifted earthy and old, a camp made of habits and patience. He set his jacket near the rim, a soft island where nothing sharp would snag. The lioness lifted her head at the rustle and watched without blinking. Somewhere, a nightjar started up, stitching sound into the dark like thread. Ray rubbed grit from his palms and turned an idea into a plan. He folded the canvas like a cradle, corners tucked and tied with square knots. Rope bit into fabric, his fingers remembering the logic of loops and bends. A bowline on a bite made a sling sturdy enough for a small life. He lined it with his bandana, blue faded near white at the fold. "Easy work if you let me," he said, not for her but to keep steady. The weight of other nights settled on his shoulders and didn't feel so heavy. He tested the pulley he'd rigged through the spare wheel on the hitch. Metal groaned once and went quiet, as if agreeing to the job ahead. A beetle knocked into the canvas and righted itself with stubborn dignity. He smiled at that, because persistence has a shape you recognize. He lowered the sling until it hovered a foot from her paws. The cubs, pressed to her chest, sounded like rain under a tin roof. She shifted, muscles rolling under hide like rope drawn tight. Her eyes never left his hands, not once, not even the blink long. He eased the cradle closer and the nearest cub nosed at its edge. The lioness pressed her chin down, a wall and a shelter in one. All right, Ray murmured and drew the sling back a breath. He tried to scoop in a single smooth arc and met a quiet refusal. The cub wriggled free, determined as water slipping past fingers. Clay dusted his cheeks when he leaned too far and corrected. He changed the angle, reshaped the cradle, widened the mouth. Lined it again with the bandana and tore a shirt to make it softer. Lowered it with both hands and left the last inch to gravity. The lioness breathed out, a long line that trembled at the tail. Her paw came forward, hovered, toes splayed, claws still. She touched the canvas as if tasting it, then drew back. For 2 heartbeats nothing moved except the flame's red eye. Then she lifted her muzzle and nudged the nearest cub toward the sling. Ray forgot to breathe. The world narrowed to that small, deliberate push. "Thank you," he said to the night, to her, to every lesson that led here. He took the weight now, rope humming like a live thing between his hands. The cub settled into the canvas with a disgruntled squeak and went still. Ray pulled hand over hand, slow enough not to sway, fast enough to matter. Fibers warmed his palms. Sweat salted his upper lip and stung his eyes. Hyena chatter gathered nearer, a chorus rehearsing outside the circle. The thorn ring rustled with bodies testing the idea of a boundary. He reached the rim and slid the bundle onto his jacket, soft first. The cub blinked, sneezed, and flopped in a way that broke him open. He tucked the jacket around it, like a promise, and left it where she could see. Below, the lioness watched, ears pricked, breath counting his hands. Back down went the sling, the knight holding its breath with him. The second cub made a smaller sound, thin as thread drawn over wood. The lioness tried to stand, and the wall answered with a crumble. The ladder shifted half a rung and clanked, bright and loud as a bell. Ray caught it on instinct, body and bone, remembering work from younger days. He wedged a stone under the base with his boot and kept the rope steady. Easy girl, fell out of him again, a habit now, a rhythm. She curved around the smallest one, then made space with a tired grace. The sling kissed clay, lifted, missed, and tried again with infinite care. He felt the weight settle and began the slow pull toward open air. A voice cracked through the radio like lightning under rain. "Do you copy?" Then gone, swallowed by hills and distance. He didn't dare reach. Both hands were a contract he couldn't break. Hyenas laughed closer, a nervous joke turning into a plan. The rope sawed across his palm. The world shrank to friction and breath. He kept the pace steady, refusing the urge to drag the last feet. The cub's head bumped the rim. Canvas rasped stone in a whisper. "Almost," he said, and the word felt like a fragile bridge. Something brushed his ankle, and he didn't look to know it was grass. He lifted higher, inch by deliberate inch, until the knight leaned in. A shadow rose on the rim, not grass, not wind, a hyena, all teeth and angles. Its eyes caught ember light and threw it back mean and bright. Ray reached for the tire iron he'd laid by the wheel, fingers fumbling. The sling swung, the cub a heartbeat from safety, a heartbeat from air. Below, the lioness gathered herself, a rusty engine finding one more turn. The hyena stepped closer, clever feet testing the jacket's claim. Ray moved to block and felt the rope slip a fraction in his grasp. The canvas tilted, and the cub squeaked, a note that cut clean and high. He swung the iron once, a flat sound in the dark like tin on stone. And in that swing, his other hand let go a breath too long. The rope slid, canvas yawed, and the cub teetered on the lip of dark. Ray lunged with the iron, not to strike but to make space and sound. Metal ran, bright as noon in the middle of night, and the hyena blinked. In that blink, the lioness below rose like a tide no wall could hold. She pressed her forehead up under the sling, a mother's brace against gravity. The canvas steadied, a small boat finding shore in a storm made of teeth. Ray caught the rope again, fingers burning, promised threading bone to muscle. "Got you," he breathed, to the air, to her, to the trembling life in cloth. The hyena paced, calculating, feet light as ash across the thorny ring. He hauled true, and the cub slid onto the jacket with a soft, wet sigh. He nudged the bundle closer to the fire's red eye and spread his palm wide. Heat pressed back the night at the rim and wrote a boundary in scent and ember. The hyena tested, snorted, and backed off with a muscle-deep reluctance. Another ghosted in behind it, shoulder low, eyes lit like chips of tin. Ray swung the iron in arcs that sang, not to hurt, just to declare a perimeter. Below, the lioness's breath raked the silence and pulled it back together. The cubs answered like tiny drums, syncopated and stubbornly alive. He fed the fire a handful of dung. It sighed and swelled a shade brighter. Sparks rose and faded against a sky punched full of cold, indifferent stars. "Hold," he whispered, and felt the words settle into the ground like a stake. He hadn't solved the hardest part, getting her up without breaking the fragile pact. The latter sat like a question he couldn't force an answer to. He pulled the tarp taut, laced it with rope, and made a crude, soft ramp. Drove stakes from wheel, jack, and spade, bracing the angle with rocks and will. The canvas creaked, the pit breathed, and somewhere a jackal called once. Ray lowered the ramp's edge until it brushed her paws like a tentative handshake. "Come on, old girl," he said, voice low, the way grief talks when it learns hope. She set one paw, slipped, paused, and set it again with surgical care. Clay peeled under her claws. The rope thrummed. His shoulders took the strain. Above, the hyenas circled and complained, foiled by smoke and thorns and patience. She climbed a rung that wasn't a rung, a length of canvas pretending to be earth. Her muscles rolled like rivers under drought, finding channels they'd forgotten. She stopped halfway, chest heaving, and looked up with eyes the color of brewed tea. In them, he saw the ledger flip from fear to decision, debt paid in trust. She came again, weight on his knots, breath braiding with his in the narrow space. The ramp groaned, the stakes held, and time learned how to move without stumbling. Her head rose to the rim, whiskers touching fire-warm air, ears tasting wind. Ray stepped back, making room the way you do when someone needs to leave. The first cub squirmed toward the scent of her and piped a shout no words could hold. The hyenas faded a step, then another, reconsidering the math of their hunger. She was on the rim and not yet free, legs shaking, ribs counting the years. She nosed the nearer cub, lifted with the delicate certainty of a hook. Tiny paws tucked, tail limp, the little body went quiet in her jaw's soft vice. She took 2 steps into grass and set it down where the earth felt like home. Ray found his breath again when she turned back for the second, without looking at him. He slid the jacket closer and eased the bundle into reach with the iron's length. Her whiskers brushed the iron, a metallic kiss that made him grin despite himself. She lifted, pivoted, and the night widened around the 3 of them. Hyenas ghosted back, hopeful, reading angles. Ray swept sparks in a firm line. The predators blinked, offended by inconvenience, and slipped into taller dark. Dawn announced itself first as cool, then as birds, then as the color of forgiveness. The horizon unzipped from black to pewter to a red fine as thread. Dew found his cuffs. The fire collapsed into a hush of gray breath. The lioness stood with both cubs tucked against her forelegs, statues of need. She looked at him a long moment that did not belong to either species. Thanks, not that, just the clean recognition that lives had braided for a night. She stepped forward, pressed her muzzle once to the toe of his boot. The touch was barely weight at all. It felt like being forgiven for staying. Then she gathered a cub, and the grass parted as if it had practiced for her. She vanished toward the acacia line and returned for the last, efficient as rain. The radio found its voice as the sun cleared the termite mounds. Ray, come back, do you copy? Rode in on a ribbon of sudden clarity. He thumbed the handset and let out a breath he didn't know he'd held all year. Copy, he said, and his voice sounded like gravel, finally remembering it was river. He told them coordinates and the words mother and 2 cubs, all alive. Silence, then a soft curse of relief, then promises of fresh rope and hands. He looked into the pit, now only a hole, empty of hunger, full of mourning. His jacket smelled of milk and smoke and the faint, honest stink of survival. He folded it slow, as if quickness might chase off whatever Grace had visited. The beetle from last night trudged past, businesslike, and he laughed without sound. He drove a new stake by the pit and hung the burlap like a flag that meant, beware, packed the ladder, rolled the tarp, coiled the rope with the gentleness you give to lessons. Hyena tracks braided the sand like cursive he could finally read without fear. At the edge of the thicket, a tawny shape paused and watched, nothing asked, nothing owed. He raised a hand, palm open, the way you wave at a neighbor you hope to keep. Wind moved through the grass and made a sound like applause you don't deserve. The Land Cruiser coughed, then settled into the loyal rumble of old machines that try. Ray turned toward the road and the life that waited, smaller now in the best way. Back at home, the picture frame would see him pour coffee and not feel so cruel. He drove, and behind him, the miracle walked into daylight on 4 quiet feet.